So the rest of the story for Acts. Most of the information I'm going to be sharing with you comes from historical reports or writings, and then some of it is from other places in the New Testament. But we actually have quite a bit of documentation for this era. So we know that Paul was beheaded in Rome under Nero's regime. There's a lot of debate exactly when. That we aren't less sure of. The two most viable options are right at the end of the 2 years that he was in house arrest, or that he was released, did some traveling, went back to Rome, and was arrested again. So one of those two is probably what happened. Luke went to Greece, which is where he wrote the book of Luke and Acts. A 2nd century author wrote about him, saying, "Having neither wife nor child, Luke served the Lord without distraction. He fell asleep in Boeotia, which is central Greece, at the age of 84, full of the Holy Spirit." Wouldn't that be what you'd like to have your obituary say? Barnabas preached in Alexandria, Egypt, and Rome after leaving Paul. He founded the church that was on Cyprus, and he was finally stoned and then burned to death in 61 AD in Syria. Timothy was sent by Paul to minister in Thessalonica and in Corinth. And Eusebius, who is a 3rd century historian, said, right at the beginning of the 3rd century, said that after Paul's death, Timothy was the first bishop, forget which town he went in, and I didn't write that. Also, he protested, I think in Corinth, I think that was Corinth. He protested some of the worship of Artemis, and he was stoned at the age of 97. So he lasted a long time. Bishop carries a lot of connotations for us, but at this point, before all the pomp and ceremony got added, it's basically the lead pastor in the community. So sort of the pastor of the pastors in that town. So kind of set aside some of your stereotypes. Titus served Paul during his long stay in Ephesus. He was sent to Corinth to help the church there with issues of immorality and also to mediate reconciliation in their conflict with Paul. And that's in the letters to Corinthians, we see all that. He then became the first bishop in the church at Crete, which is where he was when Paul wrote the letter of Titus to him. And he died in Crete in 96 AD. Silas, who also went by Silvanus, was with Peter in Rome, and then he became, no, I was wrong about the other one, I forget where Timothy was. He became the first bishop of Corinth, and he died in northern Greece. John Mark and Paul mended their rift, and they ministered together. Mark eventually went to Rome, and early Christian writers, several of them actually, mentioned that he handed down to us in writing, the things that Peter had proclaimed. So Mark is the writer of the Gospel of Mark, which is probably the first gospel to be written. He eventually went to Alexandria, Egypt, and was the first bishop there, and he was martyred there. So that's our people. So the rest of the story for the Jews. Last year, when we were studying John, we saw that there were a lot of Jews who did not want Jesus as their Messiah and King. His kingdom was built on love, it was built on justice, and it was built on service. And they wanted a Messiah who would come and he would play the Roman power game and he would win. Jesus rode into Jerusalem to the cries of Hosanna, welcoming the King. But he knew how empty and how hollow that welcome was. And as he peeks and he looks at the city, he weeps. And he says, if you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace. But now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and your children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. If a person or a nation continually rejects God and his ways, God may well eventually say, okay, live with what you want. Let's see how that works for you. And if the people want a Messiah who will fight Rome, they will eventually have a war. And it came. We saw that there have been tension between the Romans and the Jews for decades. The final trigger had two parts to it. In Caesarea, there was a brutal Gentile attack on the Jewish community, and the Roman military there just completely ignored what was going on. In retaliation, led by a militant, very nationalistic religious group, the Roman garrison in Jerusalem was attacked and all of the soldiers were killed. And things just went downhill real fast from there. The Roman army showed up in mass in 66 AD, and they meticulously worked their way from city to city, just controlling the whole region, getting closer and closer to Jerusalem. In 68 AD, there was a reprieve. Nero died, and the general who was leading the charge against Jerusalem went back to Rome, and he eventually became the emperor. And so they had a little break while all the politics is happening. And then the general sent his son back, and he took over the battle. So he shows up in 70 AD. The army reached Jerusalem in spring at Passover. They laid siege to the city, and by August, everything was done. The city was razed, the temple was completely leveled. The estimate is that 1 million Jews died in that time period, through either starvation because of the siege, through the battles itself, or the slaughter that followed afterwards. Ancients are really kind of sloppy about big numbers, but there is utterly no doubt that this was just a really, really bloody battle. The Sadducees, whose power was built around wealth and social status in the temple, lost everything. They are just no more. The Pharisees drew the scattered people back together around the synagogue system and around the Torah, now that they didn't have the temple. In their drive to maintain the Jewish identity, they closed the door completely to having Christianity as any part of the Jewish structure. So the divide between Jew and Christian at this point becomes complete. On a side note, when the Christian Jews saw the armies getting closer and closer to Jerusalem, they remembered the warning that Jesus gave, and they en masse left Jerusalem. They crossed the Jordan and went to the land on the other side. In doing so, they avoided the tragedy of what happened in Jerusalem. Isn't this good? I thought, this is really a terrible thing to do here, because this is a light and it's joyful, and this talk is just going to be dark and scary, so I apologize. This part, however, is good. Thousands of people came to the Lord right at the beginning, right after Pentecost. Most of these people would have heard Jesus speak, so the pump was really primed for quick growth. But as Paul and Peter and the others move out, there is a slow, steady growth, but it's much more limited. The church houses that are planted are really small little communities. However, like yeast, they are sprinkled all over the Roman Empire, waiting to grow and expand. And like bread, the initial changes are sort of insignificant. But this becomes the foundation for a much larger expansion. And we have some numbers up here, which I'm hoping you'll be able to read more easily than following. This is from the Christian History magazine, Converting the Empire. So you can see that in the year, and they are estimates, but they have all these charts on how they got them. So. 100, they estimate that there's about 7,500 Christians, and that's 0.0126% of the population. 50 years later, it has grown to about 41,000, and we're up to 0.07. In 200 AD, it's 220,000, and we're almost a third of the population, a third of 8% of the population. In 250, it has grown up to 1 million, so a bit over 1 million and almost 2% of the population. In 300, it's up to 6 million and 10% of the population. And if you look there, the difference between 300 AD and 350 AD is fairly dramatic. It's up to 56% of the population, and there are 34 million people. So what happens in that 50 years? They have the last but most intense persecution of the church. That is between 303 and 311, which is, at that point, they get a document that says, okay, we're going to back off. That didn't universally happen, so there's still about 12 more years after that in some parts of the realm that have a lot of persecution. But in 312, Constantine, who's the emperor at that point, becomes a Christian. In 313, the Edict of Milan provides for official toleration of Christians. So it doesn't declare Rome a Christian nation, it just says, we'll tolerate you, you're not going to get chased down anymore. But by about 340, most of the legislation that's beginning to happen leans heavy to supporting Christians and against the pagans. So this is sort of where the shift takes place. There are some absolute and obvious advantages to no longer being an ignored or a persecuted religion. But the switch had problems of its own, because now many people became Christians for political reasons with utterly no allegiance to Jesus at all. But if you want to look good with the emperor and the emperor's a Christian, you'll become a Christian. So we have a whole new set of things that begin to play into account there. So that's the rest of the story for Christians with growth. The rest of the story is Christians with persecution is a little bit less fun to talk about. As we saw in Acts, the persecution started within just months of the church being birthed, with Peter when he healed the lame man. Throughout Acts, the persecution was either by Jews or initiated by Jews, and then the Romans took over. The Jews persecuted them because they saw the Christians as heretics, and or because their presence and their message was a threat to the leadership. So this all changes in 70 AD when things kind of fell apart with Jerusalem completely. The power of the religious leaders was diminished. The separation between the two became much more complete. And so there's less authority. The Jews don't have authority over Christians anymore. However, the animosity did not go away. So if there were Jews in an area where the Romans were persecuting, they always joined in. The persecution from the Romans increased significantly. So let's look for a minute on why they thought the Christians were so bad. Because we think we're pretty good. So this is what they wrote about Christians. One of the number one things that got mentioned repeatedly is the Christians were atheists. They didn't believe in the gods. Now their one God kind of really didn't count because all these other gods they just ignored and said were nothing. And their one God was a little bit suspicious anyhow because he did not belong to a specific people or to a specific place like all the rest of the gods are. So yeah, we don't know about him. So atheists got mentioned a lot. They were also considered a degenerate cult and a deadly superstition. So superstitions at that point were any offensive religious belief or practice that deviated from Roman norms. Groups which acted without regard for rites, rituals, or the traditions of Rome were considered impious. Religion was intertwined with the social and the political, so we kind of have a pretty big divide. This is religion and this is all the rest of your life. Theirs was completely woven together. So piety to the gods was thought to ensure the well-being of the city and of the citizenry. Impiety toward the gods disrupted society, and when piety disappeared, Cicero said, life soon becomes a welter of disorder and confusion. So they felt like it threatened their whole social culture. And the Christians didn't. The Christians refused to participate in community-wide religious rites, but also many of the things that we would consider civic activities, because they were woven through with religion. We might have considered this a civic thing, but it was a civic religious thing worshiping this God. And so there was just a lot they didn't do, and they did look very impious. The charge of superstition might also have been strengthened because the Christians actually did break a number of the social rules. And they were strict rules. Their worship and their meals together mixed people of different social stratas in a very, very stratified culture. People were supposed to stay in their place. They gave much more respect and position to women. Their commitment to purity in marriage was like just plain weird. And their financial care for one another and for the poor was just confusing. So they stood out as being very unique. They also refused to give the divine emperor the honor and the loyalty that he deserved, and they did not respect the Roman authorities. So that last part would translate, they didn't renounce their faith when the authorities told them they were supposed to renounce their faith. Therefore, they were very stubborn. And they talked about a new king and a new kingdom, which sounded treasonous, although they never led any rebellions. And they were cannibals. So that would have been a misreading of communion. But because of those first three things, points 1, 2, and 3, they were willing to believe all kinds of evil about these people. Can you imagine how hard it would be to be Christians, to have your life dedicated to righteousness, to loyalty to Jesus, to loving one another, and this is what they think of you? The level of misunderstanding and slander must have been really a struggle on how to handle that. When we think of early Christian martyrs, we tend to think of Christians being mauled by lions. And that actually happened. So did crucifixions and burnings and beheadings. But it wasn't constant, and it was seldom empire-wide. It tended to be very localized. And it came in waves. These waves could have been initiated by the emperor, but they also could have just been local areas where a leader or a bunch of neighbors gathered and it just flared. There were 8 emperors who were key persecutors, although there were shorter bouts in between these guys. And we're only going to discuss Nero because he's the one that impacts the people who were in Acts. On the white round table over there, there's a handout that covers some of this if you guys want more information on it. All right, so to center our time, Paul's house arrest was probably between 60 and 62 AD. In the summer of 64 AD, a fire broke out in the city of Rome, and the flames spread quickly. There was a lot of wooden structures. It raged for 6 days and 7 nights, started at night. By the time it burned itself out, 70% of the city was destroyed. Rome had 14 districts, four of them remained intact, 3 of them were completely leveled, and the others were left reduced to ruins and some scorched areas, but largely gone, and the loss of life was significant. So Rome was a big town, city. Estimates were that there were well over 1 million people. We know fires. We know how disconcerting they are. Can you imagine 70% of Denver being burned? The destruction was phenomenal, and people were scared and they were angry. Even prior to the fire, Nero was no longer popular with the masses or with the Roman leadership. So they were more than willing to believe that Nero had some part in this. To divert their anger, Nero found a scapegoat in an obscure religious group. That would be the Christians. And many of the Christians in Rome were arrested, and they were put to death in some really, really horrific ways. Partially for the amusement of very angry people and a twisted emperor. Many died in the circus games, but this persecution is largely confined to Rome and the area around Rome. It didn't spread through the whole empire. Tradition says that Peter was killed during this time. He was crucified. He chose to be crucified upside down because he didn't feel like he deserved to die the very same way that Jesus did. Priscilla and Aquila had returned to Rome. They were beheaded together, but I couldn't find out for sure if it was in this time that they were beheaded or if it was later. So I found this interesting. Rome liked order. Their approach to conquered nations tended to be, pay your taxes, don't get too rowdy, and we'll pretty much leave you alone. Now that's not the story we see because the Jews weren't actually good at either one of those. The Christians fell out of favor, again, because they did not fit the appropriate order. They didn't fit the box. But it turns out another place that the Romans liked their order was in their blood sport. This is a quote. The Romans' compartmentalized thinking was on full display in their scheduling of the blood sports, which usually followed a regular, day-long schedule. The events would begin in the morning with a beast hunt or mass execution by animals. And as the century goes, as time goes on, the blood sports get bigger and fancier and more deadly. So frequently they would have both of those. The beast hunt where they let animals go and then they hunt them down in the middle where people watch. And the mass execution by animals was where most Christians died. But it was not just Christians who died then. Some of our good friends who sailed with Paul could have been at that point. And this is true in all of the waves of persecution until it ends. That was one of the places where Christians were killed. The violent spectacles would be this is just crazy because we're in such a different place. The violent spectacles would be interrupted by dancing or athletic competition to go with lunch. Lunch should be a little nicer. And then afterwards, there would be the gladiators. Often it would begin with condemned criminals who were not true gladiators, and they would fight for a while. And then the gladiators would come on. And there were schools for gladiators, and this is a big deal. These events could be held at thousands of amphitheaters around the Roman Empire. The most visible, and the one that we think of, was the Colosseum in Rome. This would not have happened under Nero because the Colosseum wasn't built until after him. And with the fire, there was actually only one amphitheater left standing in Rome, so we know where it would have taken place. The persecution lasted until Nero's death in 68 AD. Rome had 4 emperors in 1 year. The last one standing was the general who had come back from Jerusalem. And he was just way too busy working on consolidating his power structure. And so the Christians sort of faded from view, which was a very good thing. It is easy to listen to all of this with just horror, and to hear about current persecutions with pain and dismay, and to look at the changes in our country with fear and with a desire just to withdraw. But we can learn a lot from these brothers and sisters that walked a very hard path before us. So this is how they got through with triumph. First, they saw their lives and their suffering as connected with Jesus and with his suffering. The church understood that the believer's suffering and death was a concrete and literal realization of the death and burial of Jesus that was enacted figuratively every time a Christian was baptized. And they looked at verses like 1 Peter 4, this is 12 and 13. Dear brothers, don't be surprised at the fire trials that you go through as if something strange was happening to you. Instead, be glad, for these trials make you partners with Jesus in his suffering, so that you will have the wonderful joy of seeing his glory when it is revealed to the world. And they just really saw a connection between what they went through and what Jesus went through on their behalf. Their experience of Jesus through the Spirit was also very strong in the midst of their torment. And they felt like their strength that they had and the testimony that they gave was the fulfillment of Mark 13. When you are arrested and you are brought to trial, don't worry beforehand about what to say, because it will be given to you. For it's not you speaking, but the Holy Spirit. And there are amazing stories of the bravery and the words spoken by some of these people. There was one man who was in his 80s, upper 80s, and the judge felt bad in condemning this old man. And so he said, well, just stay away with the atheists. I will turn my back on the Christians. That's what he meant. So this elderly Christian elder looked up and he waved to the crowds around them and said, away with the atheists. And they threw him to the animals. His other comment was, I have served God faithfully for these 84 years and he's done nothing good for me. Why would I turn away from something good to something less? Which didn't go down well either. They chose nonviolence in response because that was how Jesus had faced his trial and execution. And because Jesus said things like, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on the cheek, turn the other one to him. And so that dictated the way they approached things. But they didn't see nonviolence as just a passive resignation. Okay, fatalistically we will go die. They saw what they went through as part of a spiritual battle against the very powers of hell. So life wasn't the victory, but dying well to the glory of God, to the honor of God, was what gave them victory. And another man, this is in the 300, so in that last one that I told you about, he said, God permits persecutions to be carried out against us that the people of God may be increased. And what was going on then was that people actually rejected the old gods because of the cruelty of what they saw. And they wondered, what could be so good that these people are willing to suffer loss of property? And sometimes it wasn't death. Sometimes it really was, we'll take your property, we'll take your rank, we'll make you slaves. Or light, or bodily pain, or even torture. What made facing all of that better than just saying, okay, I'll show work the gods? This was a little bit less true right at the beginning. Under Nero, one of the eyewitnesses said, well, we know they should have died because they were very bad people. They were bad criminals, my words. But it did get a little bit out of hand in the way that it happened. So they weren't tempted at that point necessarily to change, but they did have sympathy. But in every persecution, there were people that looked at how different these Christians acted and sought out the answer to that. You know, we're honestly never going to face leopards and lions that want to tear us to pieces. But these principles still hold, whether our enemies are cancer, or old age, or loneliness, or family conflict, or whatever struggle we have. This is still a way that we can face life. And the rest of their story really can make the rest of our story much better if we follow in their footsteps.